Okay. If I did it right, this meeting is now being recorded. So just so that you're aware of that, if you don't want to use your video or if you don't want to be recorded, I am going to post this just for the students in our class, but I can't guarantee you that other people wouldn't be able to find it on YouTube. People are pretty smart about that kind of stuff. So in terms of going back to the earlier chapters, not everything on these study guides will make it onto the final exam. Some of them were, relatively limited. I wanted you to have some familiarity with practicing with those things, but they won't all be on the final exam. So, for example, in chapter 1, I think it's important to be able to define personality, to sort of say, if we're studying the science of personality and the psychology of personality, what is it that we're talking about? The psychological triad, probably not on the final exam, that idea that we're looking at both behavior and then emotional feelings and also how people are thinking about things. I do think that it's important to focus on each of those approaches to personality psychology. So the trait theory and the biological theory, I think I've said a number of times, are the mainstays of where research is going today in explaining both the causes and consequences of personality, sort of describing them, where they came from and how they can impact your development. The trait theory is about traits, no surprise there, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in subsequent chapters. Biological, definitely things you were born with or how your genes and the environment interact, using that concept of epigenetics to influence how you react to things, how you react to situations. Your personality is that stable way of responding across situations. So it isn't that we respond identically in all situations, but there are some common themes. People who are high anxiety tend to be high anxiety in a variety of circumstances, not all the time, but in a variety of circumstances. So that trait theory can really help us understand that. The biology of something like anxiety can also help us understand that. The psychodynamic approach or the psychoanalytic approach, we skirted around the psychosexual stages and went straight to things like defense mechanisms. How do we explain our own behavior to make ourselves feel better about what we believe or what we've done or what we're planning to do? And sometimes those are conscious motivations, but very often using the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approach, those are below conscious thought, right? They're not something that you're consciously aware of. You're just sort of doing those things without being aware of why you're doing those things. And then the phenomenological approach encompasses both the sort of the multicultural approach, but also humanism, the idea that your human experience is very important to how we understand your personality. So humanism can help us to understand how those things play out, what your own personal constructs are, what's important to you, and whether those things are getting done. And those are the kinds of things that can influence your thoughts in that area. And then learning and cognitive is just what it sounds like. Learning theory. I put in the next number in chapter 1, number 4, psychology's definition of learning is that relatively permanent change in behavior based on experience. So when we talked last week or the week before about punishment, I think it was 2 weeks ago about punishment, that's a learning approach, right? How is there a relatively permanent change in behavior based on the experience of being punished? Behaviorism has at its core, the idea that your experiences influence what you will do next. And if something happened for you and it was positive, or you felt rewarded in some way, you're more likely to do that thing. And if it was something negative that was unpleasant for you, you're less likely to do that thing. And so that would be the learning theory. And then cognitive, how we're thinking about things, how you approach something, how deeply you think about it. Do you think about conversations that you've had before and revise them in your mind or prepare for them? If you're getting ready for a job interview, if you're getting ready to go to class, do you think about what you might be called upon to say and what your response might be? That is your cognitive approach to those kinds of things. Don't worry, I'm going to pause at the end of every chapter, so this is not a complete monologue. The reason that we don't want one big theory, one theory of everything, it would be convenient, right? Then we wouldn't have to look at all of these theories. We could just say, hey, look, we've done the research and this is the theory. When you think about something like what's the best way to teach children to read, there used to be two theories. One was teach them phonics. The other one was teach them to recognize sight words and to recognize words and to remember them that way. You know, in that case, that's an example of where they had a theory, they tested both of them, and one of them came out the winner, right? The phonics approach is by far and away the dominant way, the way to teach children to read, to enable them to become good readers and independent readers. It doesn't mean that there's no place for sight words, but in that case, 1-1. That's different than personality psychology. In personality psychology, each theory is asking a different question and answering it in a different way based on different kinds of evidence. So we really do need more than one theory. If we only had one, it might be really good at some things, but it would be terrible at others. And so it helps us to triangulate, so to speak, to have different angles at which we can approach this kind of thing. And then Funder's first law, he goes through, he says, don't memorize my laws. And so these are these often repeated things that he says throughout the book. Great strengths are often great weaknesses, and great weaknesses are often great strengths. If you're on a team at work, you may want a really introverted person who will, sort of do a deep dive and to think about something in a different way. You might also want that really extroverted person who will, just throw out all kinds of wild ideas and see what sticks to the wall. So, a strength in one area can be a drawback in another, and vice versa. Okay, so let me pause there. That was chapter 1. Do you have questions or comments about the material in chapter 1? Is there anything else that you want to go over?
Not that I can think of. I thought it was pretty well covered.
Okay, good. Anyone else? I don't want to go too quickly, and I also don't want to waste your time. Okay, so interrupt me anytime. And if I don't stop, if I don't hear you, I'll try and take a breath every once in a while. I don't really like it when I'm on a conference call, for example, and the person never takes a breath, so I can't really interject anything. So I'll try and slow down just a little bit. Interrupt me anytime, stop me anytime. When we talk about Funder's second law, Funder's third law, these aren't laws, right? These are just his observations about the fact that we can't directly observe personality. The best we can do is get clues to it, right? There isn't an objective measure of personality, but those clues tell us something, and it helps us to understand personality. So, I like his kind of folksy, approachable way of talking about personality. He doesn't try and make it sound like it's something that only a personality psychologist could study. We're all doing this all the time. It's just that you now are aware of tools, I hope, that you weren't aware of before in terms of different ways to think about personality. S, I, B, and L data. When I was first using his textbook, those did not roll off my tongue at all. So if they don't for you, try, within the next few days to identify sources of each of those kinds of data for yourself, and then go back to the book and see whether or not those would fit into those categories. Self-report data is just what it sounds like. Behavioral data can both be something that somebody else could observe or something that you say about your own behavior. So a self-report might be, I feel anxious, but a statement of, when I'm in this situation, I exhibit anxiety, I'm reporting about my own behavioral measure. So that, the S data and B data complement each other, but they, it's not always, just because the person is telling it to you does not by definition make it self-report data. Informer data is just what it sounds like. It's what your parents would say about you, your close friends, your colleagues, your coworkers would say about your personality. For some people, you will say, who's the best person to report on my personality? Maybe it's my family. Maybe it's not my family. Maybe it's my friends. Maybe it's the people I work with, or my, my closest friend. But each of those people are seeing you in certain situations, but not in others. And so there isn't anybody except for you that knows all about you. Like, you are the best reporter. The individual is the best person to report about their own personality. And then L data is based on life outcomes, and so you can see whether or not people have been in prison. You can see whether they've completed their education. You can see what their income levels are. You can see, age demographics. You can see whether or not they vote. You can talk about conscientiousness and community involvement, and then you can measure it in these other ways that don't require you to ask the person. So those are the data questions. That's number 3 on chapter 2. Reliability and generalizability. If data can be reliable without being valid. So reliability, if I get that, if I test you and then I test you a week from now, and if I get very similar scores, that's a reliable test. It's got test, retest, sort of correlation. But it doesn't mean that it's a valid measure of anything. So you can, validity is it measuring what you think it's measuring? Reliability is it measuring well and in the same way each time? And then is it generalizable? If it's a case study and I know a lot about you, I can't really generalize that to people of your age, people of your cultural background, people of your political background, anything. But if I've got a larger group of people, I can generalize perhaps to some sort of a group. So those are just concepts that are not unique to the study of personality, but that are very important in interpreting the data. Experiments in the role of random assignment is not going to be on the test. So, I think, knowing that, if you take a group of people who are anxious and test them, they weren't randomly assigned to this category. And so when you say, oh, we did an intervention and this did that thing, you really do, if you're going to do a true experiment, you need to randomly assign people to 2 groups so that you get some people who are high and low anxiety in both groups. And then you can really see whether your intervention made a difference. Constructs are just your perceptions, right? Your understanding of something. And so, or they're not just that, but that's one of the ways that they're used in personality psychology. So, constructs are important. They're important to have a definition of what it is that you're talking about or what it is that you're thinking about. And you have your own, right? And they are your reality. Just like when you think about memory, your memories are, your memory of an event is your memory of that event. It doesn't mean that it's correct or that it matches somebody else's who was also there, but it is your memory. So memory by definition is a personal thing. And then the expectancy effect, this comes up a lot in educational psychology. If you expect a particular outcome, it's more likely that you will both consciously and unconsciously do things that will elicit that behavior. And so in research, it's very important for the person who's doing the interview, for example, not to be the person who is the principal investigator who designed the study. Because if you already know, if you did the interview for this course, for example, and you already know that you're looking for a particular trait or evidence of a particular trait, then you're more likely to see it when it happens. You're also more likely to give somebody verbal and nonverbal cues, conscious and unconscious cues that will make that thing more likely to come out. So the expectancy effect is real. In education, if an instructor thinks that you will do well, they'll give you just a little bit more feedback. They will encourage you just a little bit more when you're struggling. They might speak to you in a slightly warmer tone of voice. All of those things unintentional, or unintentional in the sense that you're not trying to exclude anybody, but you do, right? And you do enhance somebody's performance. So those are a hard thing to wrap your hands around sometimes, but important. That's it for chapter 2. Questions about chapter 2?
One quick one on the expectancy effect. Excuse me. Is that essentially like a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like it's similar in concept?
It is. It's a complete overlap there. So if you believe it, it's more likely to happen. And then if you expect it from somebody else, it's more likely to happen. So yes, it's a confirmation bias. Good question. So just listen to that, right? So when I end a conversation like that or an exchange with a student like that, at the end I say, good question, right? If I don't say that every time to every student without intending to, I have complimented the person who asked it, encouraged them to ask more questions again in the future. And even though everybody was available and could hear it, it was directed at that one person. And so its effect is going to be strongest on that one person. So that's where these really subtle cues can really, snowball is probably too big of a word for it, but they accumulate and they have a cumulative effect. Chapter 3. So the MMPI, in chapter 3, we talk about different methods of test construction, rational, empirical, and factor analytic. I think for purposes of, sort of going forward with this test and in the future, if you know that factor analysis exists and at some point in your career you're called upon to use it, perhaps you'll remember that it was used in the development of personality tests, and you can go back to it there. But it's a statistical technique. Rational and empirical methods will be on the final exam because it's very important to think about how these personality tests were constructed. The MMPI is an example of empirical test construction. Empirical test construction takes known populations and finds the way that they answer, that sort of at the common theme in the way they answer certain questions, and then says, okay, we tested a bunch of people who had antisocial personality disorder or narcissism or had, it was originally done with psychopathology. So we took this population of people who we knew had this diagnosis and we looked at what the common themes were and how they answered these questions. And then when we give you this test, we say, you answer like a narcissist, or you answer like a psychopath, or you answer like, whoever it is that you answer like. The questions themselves may have nothing to do with personality, right? So they could be questions about historical significance. They could be questions about the weather. They could be questions about plants. They might have nothing to do with personality, but it turns out that people with this personality disorder or this psychological disorder tended to answer them that way all the time, or often enough that it grouped as a cluster. So the empirical method of test construction, the MMPI used that. And so what they did was go out and find populations or identify populations that had a disorder and then look for those themes. The other method is the rational method. And the rational method is the one that you would expect. And honestly, if you say empirical, people think, well, empirical data, it's scientific data. What's the difference between rational and empirical? And so that's why I'm sort of belaboring the difference. The rational method is, if you look at it, it has what we call face validity. It's like, it's a question about personality. How extroverted are you? That's rational test construction. Anyone could look at it and know that they're being asked about their own personality and then answer about their own personality. We assume that people who are taking the time to take a personality test actually want, they're not trying to throw the results. They really do want to know more about their personality in most cases. And so they are a good person to report, but that rational method, they know what you're asking. So if you wanted to portray yourself as, wildly well-adjusted, you would know what to do in an empirical test, in a rational test. In an empirical test, you wouldn't know what to do. It's like, should I say I like eggplant? Because I'm not really sure what that means, and I don't see what that has to do with my personality. And yet, it may turn out that only the psychopaths like eggplant, right? Or don't like eggplant. I don't know. If you like eggplant, yeah, that was just an example. The thematic apperception test and the Rorschach test are both projective tests. And in that sense, you're asked to look at something that's ambiguous and tell a story about it. And the story that you tell is going to be different than the story that everybody else tells. And it might tell us and give us a window into your personality. So it's projective in the sense that you're projecting your personality onto this ink blot by telling a story about what you see. If you look up at the clouds and you can find something, what is it that you find? Do you find, smiley faces? Do you find, puffy gardeny things? Do you find a flower, or do you find threatening things, right? And different people will look at the same sky and find different things that they're looking at. They're projecting their personality by what it is that they notice or make up for themselves about that ambiguous image. Okay, that's pretty much it in terms of the final exam for chapter 3. Do you have any questions about there are other things that were on the original study guide, but I'm fairly certain they're not in the test, and so I don't want to spend too much time. I want to conserve your time. Okay, chapter 4, I would focus on number 2, the person-situation debate. I think it's a really important distinction. Sometimes people will say, I'm different in every situation. It's like, no, you're not, right? Like there's something about you that interprets situations in, just the fact that it is a situation, that you recognize it as something that requires action, makes you different from how somebody else might do that. And so there are commonalities across situation, but you're not, identical. Like every time you walk into a classroom, you're not exactly the same, but there's probably a common theme in how you approach group settings. That person situation debate says they're both important, but your personality brings a lot to the table and influences what happens next and how you experience that event. If you're a pure situationist and you say there is really nothing for personality psychology to study, it all has to do with the situation, then, I think I said this before, you could have stopped reading the book at chapter 4. Like everything else in the book is based on the fact that personality matters. And so I believe personality matters. And certainly the people who study this believe that it matters. I think it could also be an interesting proposition to say, if you do, I don't think it matters. I think it's all about the situation. But then you've got hard work to do in chapters 5 through 18 to convince yourself that all of that is built on sand. I think just recognizing situationism for what it is, and what the consequence of is of thinking in that way. Then the significance of the number of trait-related words in the English language, I think just highlights how interested we are in personality, right? We don't have 2 words for the same thing. If we have 2 words, it's because one means just ever so slightly something different than the other word. And we have thousands of personality words. And so there are just so many ways that we can describe personality. And I think that's it's an interesting outcome of all of that. Okay, so that was up through chapter 4. Then on exam 2, we had chapters 5 through 9. Make sure where we are for time. How's it going so far? Like, am I going too fast, too slow?
I think it's fine.
Okay. Again.
Yeah, and if we didn't catch anything, we can always rewatch this when it goes live, right?
Okay, yeah, and I feel bad if you have to, so yes. But sometimes I rewatch them too, and that's painful too, so, okay. Chapter 5, so moderators and convergent validation, I'm not pushing forward to the final exam. Expectancy effects, we talked about that a little bit before, so nothing new in chapter 5, other than there are more examples in chapter 5. So if you're not super clear on expectancy effects, that's a good place to look. Good judges of personality. I think it's important to know that many people say that they are an excellent judge of personality. I've met lots of people. They go, I should have been a psychologist. I'm really good at that. And I never say it out loud, but I think to myself, if you're saying that, you're probably not that good at it, right? Because anybody who's really good at it thinks, you know what, there's just a lot of ways you can make a mistake. And the more you know, the more you realize how complicated it all is. So one of the differences that they found is that people who say they're a really good judge are no more accurate than the people who don't say that. People who have more practice are more reliable. They're more likely to get the same answers on things. But people who think that they're excellent at it don't necessarily do any better. There are a lot of ways you can make mistakes when you're judging other people's personalities. A good trait is not a good trait in the sense that it's something that everybody would want to have. In this context, or in the context of this course, a good trait is something that you could observe. And so it's hard to observe sort of moral thinking, right? But it's easy to observe extroversion, right? So some traits are better than others at being detectable by somebody else. The trait observability and accuracy of judgments, interjudge agreement, that idea of getting, if 2 or 3 people are all watching the same video and saying, when and for how long did somebody exhibit this trait or that trait, the extent to which they can overlap and all get the same answer gives you more confidence that what they're measuring is measurable, and that their operational definition of how they're going to measure it holds water, or is something that can be used in science. Strong and weak situations. In a strong situation, strong and weak situations talks about the extent to which you're able to vary within that situation. And so sometimes the situation constrains your behavior so much that you don't see a lot of variability, and it doesn't tell you a lot about somebody's personality. Watching somebody in the library, watching somebody at a funeral, watching somebody in a situation where there are all kinds of rules and everybody knows them and a lot of people adhere to them, doesn't give you a lot of chances to see individual differences. On the other hand, if you just sort of go out, walking in downtown Raleigh or at Dick's Park, you see lots of different behaviors. The situation doesn't tell everybody what to do. And so you see some people talking loudly, and some people in groups, and some people individually. There are all kinds of different ways that you could observe people and see individual differences there. The realistic accuracy model of judgment, I think it's useful to have a model. It isn't like, it's sort of like Funder's laws. It's not a law, it's not set in stone, or it's not carved in stone, but it does help you to have some sort of a framework. It's like, if we're going to study this thing, how do we start? It's like, I know, let's build a table, and we'll look for these things, and we'll count them, and then we'll add them up and see if we get differences. So it's useful to have a model. The realistic accuracy model says, is this something that's relevant? Is this behavior relevant? Is it something that we can detect? Would we be able to see it? If we see it, are we able to use that information in some way? And is it available to us, right? Is it something that we can study? So it's just an interesting model to say, not everything is going to be easy to study or easy to observe. And so we have to think about how we're going to do those kinds of things. Then the transparent self theory, the more transparent you are, the lower your anxiety level and the higher your health is going to be, generally. And it doesn't mean that you have to wear your heart on your sleeve all the time. But keeping things to yourself and ruminating and thinking about them has a psychological cost. And psychological costs also manifest themselves in physical costs. And so your immune function will be compromised. You won't be as able to fight off a virus if you're exposed to one, if you're under a lot of stress. And so we know that there are these stress-related illnesses. And so the transparent self theory says, if you just tell people, instead of trying to help not hurt somebody's feelings, or trying to sort of dance around and make excuses because you don't want to do this thing, but you feel bad about yourself for not wanting to do this thing, you do all these things. If you stop all of that and are more transparent and just tell people, it's like, I would go with you, but I don't want to, right? I don't want to do that thing. Then all of a sudden, to the extent that you've been able to do it in a humane way, both for you and your conversational partner, it reduces anxiety, right? Now it's clear. Now you're transparent. So the more transparent you can be about what your needs are, what your desires are, what you like, what you don't like, the better your physical health will be. Comments on chapter 5? Okay, we're definitely getting to 9, and it's going to be less than an hour. Chapter 6, the essential traits. There are different ways of thinking about essential traits. There's ego resiliency, there's ego control. And so go back and just review those and be familiar with what those essential traits are. That is not the big 5, right? So those essential traits, it isn't just that the big 5 are essential. There's essential trait theory, and then there's the big 5 theory. So I would know those differences, or note those differences. And again, you know, this is an open book test because we don't have a testing center because of the situation that we're in. You know, you'll be able to look some of these things up. So for the things on the study guide that you feel like you're not as strong on, write down some page references. You will have time to pause. On this test, you can't backtrack. So once you've answered a question, you're done with that question and you're moving on to the next one. So don't hurry, you know, sort of keep track of time. Don't push yourself. I don't know why I'm putting testing advice right in the middle of a video. But note on the study guide or on a piece of paper or somewhere, you know, if essential traits are something that don't roll off your tongue, or if you're, you know, sort of constantly second guessing yourself about whether you got them right or not, you know, that's a page to flag or a page number to jot down so that you can, when you get to a question about essential traits, you can pause for a minute and take a little bit longer on that question. On the big five, you know, when we talk about trait theory, almost everybody is talking about the big five. You know what the big five are and how they differ from each other. You probably saw them in introductory psychology. If you've taken a developmental class, you've seen them there. And so the big five come up all the time, both in conversation, you know, how extroverted is somebody, but you don't always say how conscientious is somebody as a personality trait. But those big five are orthogonal in nature, and orthogonal means they are non-overlapping. It doesn't mean that they don't connect to each other, but if I know where you are on 4 of the big 5, that really tells me nothing about where you're going to be on that 5th one. Each one of those is independent of the other, so it really is sort of a 5-dimensional kind of a model in that sense. Single trait, many trait, essential trait, and type approaches. Okay, so single trait we know, many trait, you know, we know, essential trait we know. The type approach is Myers-Briggs, for example, you know, a personality type. A personality type can be helpful in giving, you know, with one word or one phrase, you can engender in somebody else a picture of the person that you're talking about. You can talk about it in that way. The problem with that is so much data is lost. Like, we don't really have types, right? All of the big 5, you're on the spectrum on each of those things. And so it isn't that you're one or that, you know, you're not an, you know, an ECAN or whatever. It's not a this or that. And that's the problem with type theories. It's you're introverted or extroverted. You're, you know, you're thinking or feeling, you know, and by the way, I don't know that thinking and feeling really should be opposite ends of the same spectrum. Sensing and judging, I'm not a Myers-Briggs expert, but when you look at what those dimensions are, you know, the absence of one doesn't seem to indicate the presence of the other. And so it's problematic for a lot of reasons. The Myers-Briggs is not used in psychology. It's also not on the final exam, so you don't need to spend a lot of time looking at Myers-Briggs. So that, you know, that was number 7, sort of the limitations of the type approach versus traits. Ego resiliency, ego control, over control, and under control. You know, this is Jack Block and Eysenck. So just keep those in mind and know what those things are. If, you know, ego control is self-control, right? And ego resiliency is how can you adapt? You know, if you have a lot of self-control or little self-control, and then that changes how you react to a situation, what's your ability to remedy that? What's your ability to do something about that? And that's where the resiliency comes in, the adaptation or the adaptive nature of that. The NPI, the narcissistic personality inventory, is not on the test. You know, I think you know, the reason I talk about narcissism, we don't spend a lot of time on disorders in this course, but narcissism comes up a lot in just general conversation. So I think, you know, knowing more about it related to personality psychology will serve you well when you're having social conversations for the rest of your life. Chapter 7, the biology of personality. You are born with a temperament. Your temperament is biologically based, not biologically determined, but it is in your genes, right? There is a genetic component to your temperament, and your temperament as an infant influenced how people interacted with you, if they tiptoed around you, or if they engaged with you, if they threw you in the air, or if they tried to not wake you up because when you woke up you would be cranky. So temperament, you know, it influences the relationships you have with other infants and toddlers. As you grow up, it evolves into the basis for your personality. So it's biologically based, but there's a strong environmental component as well, because people are interpreting it and treating you differently because of it. And you also are seeking out different kinds of situations because of it. If you're a shy child, or if you're high anxiety, you'll be more reticent on the playground. And then that means that you're going to interact with different kinds of kids. You might not be in the middle of a rugby scrum on the kindergarten playground. I don't know if kindergartners play rugby, but you can catch the drift there. Narrative identity development. The McAdams research talks about how we're building a life story, right? You have a story about yourself. You have an idea about who you are. Initially, when you were younger, you were the actor, right? And you were just doing things and you didn't really reflect on them. And then as you got older, you reflected on your own behavior, your own experiences, your own desires. What are the things that you've done and what are the things that you'd like to do? And as you get even older, you will become the narrator of your life story. And and that narrative identity, that story that you're building, will also influence the things that you do. Is what I'm about to do, this trip that I'm about to take, is that consistent with my narrative identity? And if not, do I need to rewrite a little bit of my story? Or do I need to change a little bit about what it is that I'm doing to fit my story? There's just lots of different ways of thinking about how what we say about ourselves influences what we think about ourselves, and also what we think about ourselves, how that influences what we say about ourselves. So that bidirectional effect. The social clock is a theoretical construct that the society that you live in, or the culture or subculture that you find yourself in, the community that you find yourself in, has particular expectations about what the right time to do things is. And it differs based on gender. It differs based on, all different kinds of things. If you lived in Wisconsin, you might have a different social clock than if you lived in, Southern Louisiana. Not wildly different perhaps, because you're all still within the United States, but there are regional differences, also national and international differences in social clocks. It's a social construction. But that, sort of influences, do I think I'm, do I have an, when you're young, do you have an idea of what you want to have accomplished by the time you're 30 or 40 or 50, if you can think that far ahead? And then that becomes part of your social clock. Do I feel like I'm on time? Am I late? Am I early? Those kinds of things. I would say the 6, 7, and 8 on chapter 7, I don't recall there being anything on the final exam about that. It doesn't mean that just because it's not on the final exam, it's not worth talking about, but I'm trying to conserve your time and get through this. In chapter 8, Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis talks about how sort of the brain interacts with and interprets different kinds of experiences that you have. And so the information that your brain is interpreting, and then how you think about that and what you do next, that can influence it. So hormones and neurotransmitters, I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, or we're not going to get into the weeds on that, nor are we on parts of the brain. So I would say the rest of, I would go back and look at the somatic marker hypothesis, but that's probably the only one that I would review in chapter 8. Chapter 9, epigenetics, how genes and environment interact across the lifespan. So just because you have the gene for something doesn't mean that that gene is active, but it might take a particular experience or level of maturation. It could be when you're an adolescent, that gene will turn on. And then you'll know whether that's going to influence your personality or not. So behavioral genetics looks at tries to tease apart those differences. I don't recall there being, and when I say I don't recall, I was working on the test today, so fairly certain that behavioral genetics is not on the final exam. But the concept of epigenetics is, so that idea that just because you have genes for, genes can be activated or inactivated based on the experiences that you have. So there's that constant dance between biology and the environment in producing in producing development. Then that last thing in chapter 9, biological reductionism. It's just terminology, but can everything be reduced to biology? And more, the more we study personality, the more and more we're learning about the biology and the biological influences on personality. And so if you took this course 50 years ago, biology would be a very small part of it. You take this course 50 years from now, and biology might be all of it, right? We might have gotten rid of everything else. I don't know. I can't see into the future in that way. But biological reductionism is the idea that biology can explain, everything can be reduced to having some influence by biology. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing